Welcome to Clocking Out, episode number 1, brought to you by Careerminds. I'm your host, Raymond Lee. And to kick off this first episode, I've decided to take a little bit of an unconventional approach to launching this first episode. Before interviewing any guests, I decided that I'm going to get interviewed by a friend and fellow podcaster. So you can get to know the person behind the podcast, a person who's made several choices to clock out through his career. And I have to say that the universe works in mysterious ways, because it didn't take me long to find my friend Steve Mellor, who, quite frankly, I believe was the perfect person to interview me. I met Steve last year at an HR conference in Las Vegas, and we connected in the speaker's lounge where we became fast friends. Steve lives in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he's the former collegiate LSU swim coach, where he took Brooks Curry to the Olympics and won a gold medal. And in honor of that, I'm drinking out of my LSU tumbler here. In my mind, Steve was the perfect person to interview me, because not only does he have a successful podcast called The Career Competitor, but he's recorded hundreds of episodes, and over his career, Steve has clocked out and made major career changes and choices along the way. And in full disclosure, Steve doesn't know this yet, but I'm looking to get coached by someone who has a successful podcast. So without further ado, please enjoy episode number 1, who is Raymond Lee. All right, Steve, here we are.
Here we are, episode 1.
Episode 1, it's the launch.
That's right. And I'm so honored and delighted to have been given the lofty role of playing interviewer for these first few episodes, man.
Yeah, well, I have to come clean with something.
Go for it.
All right, so in full disclosure, I know that a couple of weeks ago, I reached out and pitched you to interview me as my first podcast launch. And, this is the first one. And as I did my research, there's no certification out there, and there's no training that kind of gets you ready for this kind of thing. And so, I need a coach, man.
You need a coach.
Yeah.
You need a coach.
So
I'm going to give you some podcast coaching here, podcast interviewer coaching for these first few episodes.
I appreciate that.
And then I'll pass it over to you and see how many tens upon, I'm sure, hundreds of episodes you end up compiling through this awesome podcast, man. I mean, the mission for it is just really unique and really beautiful. I think it's going to bring so much impact and insight to so many for many, many years to come. So for me, it's just a privilege to be part of something that I know is really just the seed of something that's going to grow for so long beyond this first episode.
Well, I know that we're going to jump into your story here in a little while. And, the fact that you coached a collegiate swimmer to a gold medal is quite impressive. So I feel like I've recruited the best here to give me some coaching advice to launching a great podcast. So, without that setup, you want to jump right in?
I do, man. Yeah. And honestly, the best way for us to do this is to start with what I believe could be either the easiest or the most difficult question in the world to answer. Is just to simply say, who is Raymond Lee? Who do we get the privilege of getting to know as eventually you'll become the interviewer of this podcast. But let's get to know the man behind this podcast. Who is Raymond Lee?
Well, I appreciate that. And, it's, I guess it goes pretty deep, but, I guess first and foremost, I was named after my grandfather, who was Raymond Brechtel, and always went by Ray. And I think when my mom named me Raymond, she was always wanting to keep the name Raymond. So I was never Ray. And so when I jump on calls, people are like, do I call you Raymond or Ray, or what do I call you? So it's always been Raymond. When my mom gets mad at me, or when she got mad at me, she would always emphasize the Mund, or, the Raymond. And then when she got really mad, she would, say Raymond Michael Lee. And
the middle name, man, the power of the middle name.
Yeah. But so I grew up right outside of New Orleans, and had two parents who were super young. They, 18 and 19 years old when they had me. I grew up in a good home right outside of New Orleans, and it was kind of rough for me growing up as a kid. My parents got divorced when I was 8 years old, and so the home sort of broke up at a young age for me, and life was tough, and so I think I had to grow up really fast. I had a brother who I became super close with. He's about 2.5 years younger than me, it was a tough road. I was not the best kid, Steve. I'll be honest with you. When my parents separated, I found myself getting into trouble quite a bit. I'll share a quick story with you. And I don't know if you've experienced this back in England when you were a kid, but when I was growing up, it seemed to be really cool to kind of go around the neighborhood and roll people's houses. It's when you take toilet paper and you go on people's lawns and you run the toilet paper down the trees. And that seems to be like a popular thing. But I thought maybe if I did my own house, I wouldn't get caught, but I actually got caught in the act. So is that so? You do stuff like that back in England?
We never did the toilet paper. I feel like that it requires it's more of an art form. The more, I've seen that over the years and heard about it. I'm like, throwing it at the right angle and all that kind of thing. I feel like we're a lot less subtle as Brits. We'll just accidentally throw something right at your house and probably wake you up in the process. So I think whatever you were doing, while may not have been the right thing to do, at the same time, it doesn't sound as though it was causing too much damage, but obviously it was creating a little bit of an attention towards yourself. Huh?
Yeah. I think that's the case. I was looking for attention. And I'll tell you the other thing I did, which really just kind of really brings to light this, the mischievousness of me as a kid was I had this idea of going around and switching people's mail from their mailboxes. And I would go to my neighbor's mail and I'd take their mail and I'd, ride my bike 2 blocks down the street. I'd put it in their mailbox and then, vice versa. And in that case, I wasn't so smart because I was the only house in the neighborhood where I didn't switch the mail. Right. And so at the end of the day, the parents were kind of scurrying around and they said, well, all of our mail's messed up. And our house was the only house that the mail didn't get messed up. And, I got in a lot of trouble there. But so, I was a bad kid, Steve. I was looking for a lot of attention and, it was a hard situation at home for me.
Yeah. But, something you said there while you were talking through getting to that point, obviously that moment where parents split up, there's this, reaction of what you could maybe expect from an 8-9-year-old, to be fair. Again, it's not something that while someone may listen to this and be like, oh, I wouldn't want my kid to do that. It's like, well, at 8 or 9, that's kind of maybe something that you would at least understand that this is their way of acting out. But something you were alluding to as well is this notion of, while it was a tough start, there was this emphasis and need to grow up fast. So, you've had these couple of incidents where you've been caught in the act, but I'm assuming at some point you just kind of had this awakening moment or something came into your life where it was like, listen, it's almost like if I don't make that shift here, who knows where I'm going to go? I'm just curious, when did that moment come where you felt that growing up fast was the solution that you were going to actually choose?
Yeah, no, it's great. My relationship with my brother is clearly that pivotal point where, he's about 2.5 years younger than me. And he was looking for a mentor, in a house where your parents are separated and not around very much because they're in their late teens, early 20s, and they're trying to make a life of their own. And I found myself having to take care of my brother quite a bit. So, falling into that role where, that there's this accountability for, being there for your younger brother, really made me feel valued. And over the years, just brought us so close together. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, what was it maybe about that role that spoke to you? Why did it sounded like it came very easy to you when that awakening happened? It was like, oh, hey, I'm going to step into this and I'm going to play this mentor role in my younger brother's life. Like, what was it about that role that really resonated and spoke to you?
Well, he's someone who was looking for guidance, and, seeing him, for example, he and I played baseball together, and, watching me play baseball and being the athlete that I was, allowed him to kind of flourish at a young age and grow as an athlete. And so there was actually a time where he and I played on the same team together, and, seeing him really develop as a baseball player brought me a lot of satisfaction. And I think, when I think back as far as my development's concerned, seeing him grow has allowed me to, really find that satisfaction. So, yeah.
I love that. I love that. And it's funny, like, I was a younger sibling. And yet what was funny is that by about the age of 10 or 11, I was taller than my sister.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've always had this funny thing of like older little brother. Was it bigger little brother and then little big sister, something like that. And we've always joked about it because there was this time in my life where I had a very similar moment where my sister actually experienced a lot of bullying growing up, and I kind of saw opportunities to step in and found that courage to do so, even 2 years younger than the girls that would be bullying her. And for me, it's this moment where you just say, hey, I see something in someone that means something to me, and I want to do something about it. And I feel as though I have a role in this, and they want me to have a role in it too. Like, they're looking to me to play a role.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really hearing that in this story with your brother, of this notion of wanting you in his life, not just, hey, brother. It's more like, hey, Ray, please guide me, help me, get me to where I feel as though I can get to. But I have to assume that in that relationship, he was actually doing just as much for you as you were for him in terms of you finding your way.
Yeah, it certainly has evolved. And even today, when I think about our relationship today and how we show up for one another, it's more of like we're being versus doing. And it has allowed our relationship to be, as strong as we are today. And that foundation of us at such a young age has provided the support that, he and I weren't getting from our parents at the time.
Sure. So you come through childhood, you build this incredible relationship with your brother, and at some point, I have to assume education starts to become a priority. And if you're anything like me, you maybe put it off a little bit in life, but at some point you did eventually make it a priority. Tell us a little bit about that journey. Like, when did education become the priority, and when did you maybe start to get more specific with that education as well?
Well, I'll tell you, I wasn't the best at school either. So, I certainly was, education was important, and I had a desire to go to school. But, I think that, with being mischievous and not always the best student, I had some doubters. Some of my teachers and friends doubted that, I was going to be much of anything when I was in high school, and I was really determined to prove people wrong. I really wanted to, get an education, get a college degree, and really, kind of set the path for myself. And early on in my life, it was all about, proving people wrong, that I could actually make something of myself. So during high school, it was tough. And so, it wasn't the easiest for me.
Yeah. So when you're going through education like that, and you've got this sort of identity almost of, hey, it's for me to prove people wrong. It's for me to look at the data and say, you've got me pegged wrong. I'm sorry, but there's something you're missing about Raymond that I myself see. I'm curious, what point of your education was it when you maybe said, okay, I feel as though I'm doing enough to start to shift that perception of who I am and what I'm capable of, and now it's time for me to really capitalize on maybe some of the situations I have in my life? Like, was there sort of a turning moment? Was there a phase in your life, in your education, when education became something where you were able to flourish?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. So I went through undergraduate school, ended up going to Southeastern Louisiana. And, it's interesting. You worked at LSU, which is a common theme that you and I have in terms of growing up in the South. But
Sure.
I ended up at Southeastern. I graduated in just a few years, in 3 years, actually. So I was super determined to graduate. I ended up going to grad school at Louisiana Tech in industrial organizational psychology. And, again, really wanting to get the right education so that I can make an impact in the world. And I graduated from grad school. And 3 months later, as I started my job search, I have my resume on the internet. I'm starting my job search. I wake up one morning and on the front page of the business section in the Times-Picayune, which is the local paper in New Orleans, my dad was convicted for mail fraud.
Wow.
And talk about turn my world upside down. I went from, ready to just sort of set the world on fire. And, it was an interesting time because, while I was searching for, looking for my career and getting my job search started, I had to kind of grapple with all of the, things that are related to, your dad being on trial and having to go to the court and all of that stuff. And at 21 years old, it was a lot, in terms of, how do you process all of that? Right. And so what was interesting when I think about, my first job and my first experience out of college, I had, my dad had three requests for me. He actually sat me down and he said, look, I need your help. And, as you know, my parents were separated at the time. And he said, I need you to drive me to the federal prison. On this particular morning, he was sentenced for 2 years. And he said, I need you to stay in my house and kind of look after the affairs. And then the third thing he said was, I need you to run the business. He was an insurance agent at the time and had, all kinds of insurance policies and a pretty extensive insurance practice. And so, as you can imagine, couldn't say no.
Sure.
Right. Like I was like, okay. And so, I said yes to all three. So drove from New Orleans to Fort Walton Beach, Florida, to Eglin Air Force Base, where, in fact, my brother came along for the ride. So it was the two of us that drove him.
Right.
And talk about an emotional experience where, you're driving your dad to serve a 2-year sentence 3 years after you graduate college. And so, what's really interesting is that never shared this with my dad up until this point. As I kind of reflect, I had to be an insurance agent. Like I was literally immersed into taking over, handling insurance policies. And this was April of 1995 is when this happened. And a month later, New Orleans experienced one of the most significant storms. It wasn't Hurricane Katrina, but it was massive flooding around the city. And as you can imagine, sparked all kinds of claims, right? Like I was getting phone calls from policyholders and had to schedule meetings with adjusters. And, all of a sudden, I'm immersed in, now I'm an insurance agent, essentially handling insurance claims for my dad's business. And, when I think back, that was my first job out of college.
Yeah.
And, initially I was like, oh my gosh, I have to put my career on hold for, 2 years. I'm not going to be able to start my HR career with my college degree because I have to handle these insurance policies. But, what became apparent to me was that, I was just immersed into this job. And it was sort of like I needed to figure things out. And it really allowed me to start not just building experience, but building character.
And I really want to go there next, because, but before I do, it's really important just to put a huge highlighter through this point of the conversation, big circle around it, because what your story truly represents is so much of why you've started this podcast. Is that so often in life we have an education that can put us on a path where we're so clear and so sure of what we want, and we're so eager to go after it. And then life comes along. Life comes along and hands you something that you could never have possibly anticipated, let alone at 22, 23 years old. I mean, I'm 39 this year, and if something like this came along in my life, it would certainly send me off some sort of rail. But this is right out of college. And to your point, and something you mentioned as you were going through that story, you had this awakening through that education, through that college and master's degree. I'm ready to go take on the world. I'm ready to go make an impact on so many. And suddenly someone as important to you as your father comes along and says, I'm sorry, son, those dreams, that vision, that journey that you had all figured out, I'm asking you if you would have it in your heart to put all that to one side and focus on this for me instead. I mean, just from a perspective of someone who went through that. I think it's really important here for you to share with listeners, how on earth you were able to process that in a way where you not only capitalize on the opportunity and clearly did some phenomenal work for your father, but you never let go of all these other chapters and parts of your journey that we will eventually get to. Like, how were you able to stay optimistic during that time when so many would easily kind of say, well, that's it, throw in the towel? So just talk us through that.
Well, it's the influence that my mom had on me as a kid growing up, and just seeing her as a single mom. When I was 8 years old and my parents separated, my mom got sole custody of my brother and I, and seeing her work as a single mom, as a school teacher, then court reporter, working long hours to provide for my brother and I, really kind of like gave me that foundation that led me to knowing and realizing that hard work, determination, really that hard work allowed me to, just stay focused. And it set the work ethic for me, quite frankly, to get through that. And so I would say I attribute a lot of that to the influence that my mom had on me at a young age.
Yeah. And I'm really excited. Like, a couple of episodes from here, we're going to get into the story of your mom. And I think it's going to speak to, as much as that story of your own will speak to people, I think your mom's story speaks even more so to people as well. And I'm so excited to get there eventually. But going back to that realization of, like, we're getting the experience and you're getting this, accelerated development of character as well. Looking back on some of those childhood years, even some of those teachers that maybe doubted you and all that kind of thing, talk us through what that experience of taking on your father's business at such a young age and keeping his affairs in order to the point of where it sounds as though you actually allowed the business to thrive during a time where it had the potential to do so. Just talk us through what that did for looking back on those first 20 something years of your life and seeing just how far, I guess, you'd come through that time.
Yeah. Well, I think a mindset is really key for me in terms of recognizing that it's not necessarily about the technical skill that I was getting at the time. The fact that I was able to just immerse myself into something, like insurance. It wasn't necessarily what it was that I was doing, but it was the impact that I was able to make, at such a young age. I was meeting with adjusters and people that were, a lot older than me and had a ton of experience. And so, just how I showed up and the work that I was doing and the skill sets that I was getting through, just communicating with multiple people and, having to adapt and deal with change and uncertainty allowed me to, develop a growth mindset, it wasn't intentional. This is something that happened almost unintentionally where, this experience just allowed me to grow, right? So it wasn't necessarily, I stumbled a lot. I probably said and did a lot of things that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And, but, when I think back, it was, that kind of experience allowed me to develop a growth mindset where, I just recognized at an early age that taking risk and putting myself out there, while in this particular case, it was forced on me, right? I was like thrown right into it, and I really didn't have any choice, but I had to learn and adapt and grow. And I think it was that first experience that, really allowed me to transform myself to a point where, risks are always going to lead to, some hiccups and failures. And I think that was that first experience. But, so anyway, I kind of think back and I commented that I never said this to my dad, but, I'm almost thankful that I had this opportunity. I learned a lot from it. But the other thing that I was going to say is that the other thing that I learned is discipline. And at a young age, my dad was actually, he was a drill sergeant in the Air Force. And during that time, as a kid, I really, really appreciated what it meant to have discipline and have habits that lead to behaviors that, impact growth. And I really started to develop those at a young age, which I feel like were pretty important ultimately to my success.
No doubt. And eventually, when it's my turn to be the interviewee, I'll have some similar insights to share through my journey. But you've already touched on growth mindset here for the first time. I've no doubt we'll hit growth mindset a number of times over these first couple of episodes between the two of us. From a growth mindset standpoint, when did you, having come through all of that work for your dad and your dad's services time, and now I would like to believe there was a phase where you had a little bit more autonomy with what you wanted to do. Talk us through that next chapter now of just beyond the work you did with your dad and maybe what that first opportunity looked like to get out of the South. Because as we all know, you've not been in the South now for some time. So at some point that journey began. So talk us through that phase.
Yeah, it was 35 years ago now when I left New Orleans. And, there was a period. So when I graduated from college, my dad came back. It was, it was a 1-year sentence for, I guess, good behavior. I ended up landing an HR job in New Orleans for a small construction company. And I did that for about 4 years. And one of the things that was important to me at that time, having come through all of this kind of interesting stuff, my dad gone away and, growing up as, with divorced parents, I went through, some therapy and got a job. And I sort of it was time to get my head right, as far as, trying to focus on myself. And I got my first job, worked in HR for about 4 years, getting some experience. And it was probably around 1999, I decided it's time to leave New Orleans. And I'm going to say I read your book and I think of it was sort of like my intention to shock the world. I said, I'm leaving New Orleans and I'm going to shock the world. And
Love it.
I put my resume on monster.com, 1999, got a call from a recruiter for a HR job based in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And went through the interview process and ended up getting hired for a role at Corning, out of Corning, New York. And so I was leaving New Orleans, getting in a car and driving, thousands of miles to Scranton, Pennsylvania, where I absolutely knew no one. And that was my leaving New Orleans.
Yeah, and there's a big part of that story that we can't afford to skip over because the coach in me is always the curiosity starts to, the little curiosity bell alarm in my mind starts to kick in.
I love that.
And so, you're telling us this story and it's all great, but there was a big part of that you left out, which is the why. why is it that you felt the need to make that shift? Because it is as someone who's, as people have probably figured out by now, while I'm based in Louisiana, I'm not from here, as someone who's flown the nest himself, the why is a huge part of it. So tell us, why was that the time, and why was it even necessary for you to do?
Yeah. Well, there were a number of whys, and I think over the last couple of years, it's become more clear as to why I left. I think at the time, I wanted to get away from the whole situation, with my dad, and just getting away and like moving and starting anew. And I felt like, in order for me to start anew, I needed to like make a radical change in my life. When I moved to Scranton, it was the summer of 2000, and I was there for about a year. And this is when the .com bubble hit. And, within a year, there were like massive layoffs happening everywhere. And so I remember the insecurities that I felt after leaving. I questioned, I said, am I making the right decision? Because once I left and I was leaving, I get to Scranton, I worked there for a year, and all of a sudden this company's having massive layoffs, and I'm feeling like I think I'm going to have to go back home. And so at the time, it was really kind of running away from all the stuff that I was dealing with back at home. And so when I look back, it was obviously the best decision I made.
Yeah. Yeah. And so with years and hindsight now on your side, is there any more to that why? If you look back now, like obviously you're running away at the time. One thing I've been able to do over the last 20 years of my life since I moved to the US permanently, like been able to kind of get a little bit more deeper and honest about that. But is there anything more to that why? Is there anything more now in hindsight you feel as though it's just like this is why?
Steve, you're really good at this.
Some of my clients do call me their business therapist, and so, but I don't have a therapy degree, nothing like that, but
well, I have to tell you, in full disclosure, you and I never prepped for any of this conversation, right?
We didn't, man. That's why it's good. That's what makes it good, man.
It's great. Yeah. Like we talked, in fact, we met, I don't know, 9 months ago, and we had a couple of exchanges over the last 9 months, and I think it's worth even sharing. Not to digress for a second, but I think it's even worth sharing that you one of my trips back to New Orleans, I was at my brother's house in Covington, Louisiana, and you made the trip over and came over for lunch.
You gave me a reason. You gave me a reason to visit Covington, Louisiana for the first time. I never had a reason up to that day.
Right. So. You met my brother. We had sloppy roast beef po' boys, and
those are good. I'm still to this day, I'm still feeling the effects of that sandwich.
Are you? Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So we don't. It's we haven't done any prep for this, and you're really good at digging in here. Yeah. So and I have to tell you, I contemplated on whether, sharing this is something that I felt appropriate. But back when I was a teenager, I was my first job my first job, I was 16 years old. When you land your first job, it's so, as a kid, like that's like one of the most exciting things you do. It's like the first opportunity there is to make money as a kid.
Sure.
And I got a job at a car wash, and it's this car wash in Mellor, Louisiana. And I was the kid that when the car pulled up, I had the vacuum cleaner hose, and I'd go in and I'd vacuum out all the cars, and that was my job. And I loved it. So at this job, I was a victim of child abuse.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was my manager, and I never told anybody of this, by the way.
Jeez.
Yeah, it's crazy. At the time I was, 16 years old, and I had the opportunity to tell my mom, and I never did. And, fortunate for me, it was, I was a sophomore in high school, and I ended up moving to, my mom got transferred to Mississippi. And, fortunately for me, I was pulled out of the situation because we moved. But I never told anybody for almost 30 years. In fact, I just shared it for the first time 2 years ago.
Wow.
And so when you ask that question around, what are there other factors that led you to, to leaving New Orleans to pursue dreams and to,
Sure.
other locations? There was very subconsciously, it wasn't conscious, but, when I think back, it was like, I was a lot of things I was running away from as a kid. But, I've learned that over the years, is when I think about the work that I do today, I think identity is so important in terms of, really understanding like who you are as a person and the things that happen to you as a person at such a young age. You can't hide from that. And I think it's important to talk about this stuff. It's, sexual abuse doesn't discriminate, in terms of where it shows up, and how it shows up in the world. And I think it's important to talk about it because it happens to people, and I think it's important that, it's talked about.
Yeah. Well, man, firstly, thank you for sharing that. Secondly, just to piggyback off that final sentiment that you provide, my belief, and I share a lot of things around my own mental health on these sort of public platforms. The one thing I'm always an advocate for is that when someone has the sheer bravery to talk about something like this, I believe that you're a catalyst for one more person to have that same bravery, not to talk about it publicly, but maybe to talk about it for the first time. So I hope that someone's listened to this. If you are, someone that has dealt with anything like this, that this is your catalyst to not carry that burden privately, secretly anymore, and feel as though you can find support and work through it. But
Steve, I'll tell you, just to underscore that just a second, and this isn't the first time that I've shared it. Like I said, a couple years ago, through some self-reflection and discovery, I realized it was important, and I ended up sharing it with my brother. I shared it with my wife, my daughter, my dad, and ended up, I was invited to speak at a SHRM conference 2 years ago about the book, Career Fulfillment.
Sure.
And I was on stage at one of the mega sessions and shared it with 2,500 of my closest HR friends. So,
right.
I've sort of like made it a mission to normalize this by saying, this is something that we should talk about. And so I've gotten very comfortable with the fact that, it's something that happened and it wasn't my fault. But, I think certainly something that other people can benefit from as well.
No doubt. And so we've made that decision to relocate, and as you mentioned before, that opportunity came with that company Corning, and we're not too far out now from this kind of monumental moment in your life where you decide entrepreneurship is something for you, and that's very much going to be the next chapter, the next episode within this 3-part opening of clocking out. And so for me to sort of wrap up this first one, I'd love for you just to maybe provide some experience and some insights from that time with Corning, and maybe even just some of the other parts of that final sort of, chapter in your being an employee, let's say, being an employee journey.
Yeah. Well, so I started at Corning in 2000, and my role there was an HR business partner. And the company was really at the forefront of technology innovation. They were innovating optical fiber, and so Corning as a company was manufacturing fiber optic cable, and the result of the dot-com bust really was the beginning of just thousands of layoffs that were happening around the company. And so when I started, Corning as a company was doing very well over that year from 2000 to 2001. the company had to lay off thousands of people. And so I ended up becoming from hiring to firing. My role was essentially going around to different locations and having to conduct large scale layoffs around, many manufacturing facilities. And at the time, Corning never hired an outplacement company who came in to, do outplacement services. We actually did it in-house. So I was HR business partner turned outplacement consultant. I was doing workshops and interview coaching and helping write resumes and all of that stuff. And so, that was definitely the entree to the next chapter. But there was all kinds of experience that I got from Corning that really was the setup for what ultimately became, the birth of Careerminds, which is, I know what we're going to talk about in the next episode.
For sure. And before we do that, I would love to kind of wrap this first episode up with really just, just what it was like for you in that role there with Corning to get some of that confirmation of that very energy that you had there in the latter years of your education, as you talked about changing the world, leaving New Orleans to shock the world. And you had a very clear industry in terms of where you felt you could do that in. How did it feel at that time just to get so much confirmation within the work that you were doing that this is a place that you can thrive?
Yeah, it was, going from a small town in New Orleans and working for a small company to a multinational company like Corning and having the opportunity to really make an impact across many business lines, many disciplines, gave me the experience and the confidence that, I could be, if I wanted to continue the track to be a CHRO or head of HR, I knew that I had the experience to do that. But there was this there was a big fire in my belly that was not what was meant to be for Raymond. And I think it goes back to who's Raymond? Raymond's a guy who, loves building things. And, while I was getting a ton of experience at Corning and really making an impact there as an HR professional, and I saw a pathway to continued growth, I knew deep down inside, there was sort of this entrepreneurial fire that, needed to be lit. And yeah, it was a fire that, was ready to, to really have a big flame, I guess, for lack of a better word.
We couldn't have found a better way to transition into episode 2. So right here, Raymond and I are going to take 30 seconds to a minute, maybe just have a little drink, and keep this conversation going. But I'm excited to pick it up in episode 2, man, with this notion of not only recognizing that there's a spark, but how can we start to put something on that spark to where it really turns into a real flame. And just appreciate all your sharing and all your insights through your own journey here in episode 1. I'm excited to keep the conversation going in episode 2, man.
Awesome. We'll talk to you later, Steve. Thanks. I have to be on the shelf. That was a tough episode to record, and I appreciate you letting me be vulnerable. And I'm also incredibly grateful for Steve for spending time with me and getting to know my background and letting me be vulnerable. Thank you again to our sponsor, Careerminds, a global provider of outplacement and leadership development services. You can learn more about Careerminds at careerminds.com. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I'm also on Instagram at raymondlee.co. Until next time, remember, if you're stuck in your career and think it's time for a change, I would encourage you to ask these 3 questions. Does my work make me feel alive? Am I doing the things that matter to me most? And am I creating value for myself and others? Until next time.